I mean, I only got a chance to sort of stick my nose into various rooms and see the level of engagement in the various working groups. I feel life is unfair because I couldn't be in 4 rooms at once. But are you enjoying it? Has it been good? Good. I think one of the key things is that, you know, in each of these issue areas, no matter how complex, we keep finding out that we need governments, effective governance, as Alara said, capable governments, not overbearing or overreaching, but capable. We need the private sector, and we need the social sector, quite obviously. The man we're about to hear from has been in all 3 roles. He was head of state, as you know, in Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and he is now both a businessman and a philanthropist, having founded 2 different organizations. One is the Africa Governance Initiative, which we will talk about to a large extent, and the other is the Tony Blair Faith Foundation. I should note that he has, as if his hands were not full, he is also the representative for the Quartet in the Middle East, which focuses on readying Palestinians for their own state. So please join me in welcoming Tony Blair.
Thank you very much indeed, Jane, and thank you, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you at the Global Philanthropy Forum, and say thank you very much for your kind introduction with one small correction. I was the head of government. See, head of state, it's like the Queen.
Yeah.
So, we get very nervous of that type of thing, so we have to be careful that Tower of London's not just a tourist attraction. It's a wonderful pleasure to be with you again at the Global Philanthropy Forum, and look, I was 10 years as a Prime Minister, and now I've founded 2, as Jane was saying, 2 foundations, one about government in Africa, and the other to do with countering extremism based on a perversion of religion. And so I've got some experience from both sides of the fence, as it were. And what I want to talk about in my remarks today is how do we make 1 + 1, government plus philanthropy, equal more than 2? What have I learned from both experiences? And I guess when I start with government, I would say that my reflection after 10 years in government is that the only thing that is more frustrating than dealing with government is actually running one. And I'm aware of the fact that for many of you, when the theme of the conference here being about disruptive thinking, government as a disruptive force, you would very more naturally think of that as disruptive in the traditional sense of being an obstacle, not in the sense of being creative or revolutionary in its impact. In government, I actually encouraged the development of the 3rd sector, so public-private partnerships, but particularly public-private and voluntary sector partnerships. I became a great fan of the philanthropic sector, and I think its growth over these last years has been one of the most important elements in development and in the way the world has changed. But even though I'm very prepared and have deep experience of all the flaws and problems of government, I also want to say that government continues to perform, however, a role that is unique, that is necessarily profound in its impact, and because of its weight and because of the importance of the policy decisions that it makes, you both can't do without it and you need it. So the question really for us, particularly when we are considering the relationship between the philanthropic and the government sector, is how do we try and make this relationship work more effectively and work more productively for the ends both of philanthropy and for serving the people of the country. And we start with one very important thing, which is, again, in my view, one of the defining changes in politics of the past few decades. The quality of government today, in a world in which technology and capital are essentially mobile, the quality of government today is of essential importance as to whether a country develops or it doesn't develop. It's a statement of the obvious, and yet when you think about the implications, they are very far-reaching. So if you, I know you had Jim Kim here, I think, yesterday. So in the studies that have been done of countries that have been third world and got to second world over the last half century, there have been many, many examples. Scores of countries have done that. If you then ask how many countries in the last half century have gone from third world to first world, it's a much, much narrower group of countries. In fact, you can count them virtually on the fingers of one hand. And the difference, really in virtually every case, is the quality of government. The quality, not just of systems of government that aren't corrupt and that are transparent, but what I would call the single biggest challenge of government, which is what I call the efficacy challenge. How do you get things done? I mean, the hardest thing about government is doing things. You know, when I first came into Downing Street, you know, because I was the Prime Minister, I won an election, I thought it must be pretty powerful. You know, I used to sit in the cabinet chair, and I thought that if I was Prime Minister and I took a decision in the cabinet room, something happened. Now this was a delusion that it took a certain amount of time to comprehend. And then I realized actually that was just the start, and that really what mattered was how you delivered, how you took the idea and turned it into a reality. And that is really the biggest change that we have. And government in this context can work either well or it can work badly, but it has enormous impact. So if you think in the work that you do as philanthropists, supposing in any of the countries you were working, you had a government that was really on your side and committed, think how much easier it is. Whereas I suspect you spend a lot of your time trying to work your way around government rather than feeling that government is there increasing the momentum. So very briefly, here are sort of 5 lessons that I learned, and have learned not just in government, but subsequently in the philanthropic work that I have done. And, you know, I start with the concept of partnership, which is obviously crucial. My Africa Governance Initiative has had teams of people working in the countries in West Africa for several years, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. And obviously those are the countries also that were most affected by the Ebola outbreak. Now, when that happened, to my great satisfaction, actually, and pride, the teams that I had living and working in those countries refused to leave and stayed and helped the governments with their response to Ebola in West Africa. And what they did was really very interesting from this point of view of partnership between public and private and voluntary sector. There was an immense amount of mobilization of international support, of course, and an immense amount of philanthropic support that went to help those countries. But absolutely key to making it work was to reorganize the system at the center of government to make sure that that help was properly accessed and used. Now, it actually took quite a long time to get it right, more time than it should have. But the organizing force that my teams were able to provide there was an example of how government, with a combination of outside help, philanthropic help, you know, the case of Liberia, United States, in the case of the UK, Sierra Leone, the UK government, the case of Guinea, the French government, how you mobilized all that was absolutely vital to making the philanthropic work successful. And so the first thing I would say is that the importance of philanthropy and government working together is creating a sense of genuine partnership in pursuit of the goals people want to see. Secondly, where philanthropy can add something very special to government is it can generate innovative solutions. One of the biggest problems with government is that it's just slow and not very imaginative. You know, so, for example, in the work that the Gates Foundation, with whom we partner, have done on things like research and data into some of the key diseases, this is of enormous importance then in improving the ability of governments to tackle the problems that they're facing. Or Paul Allen's Medevac, very good example of where there was a particular problem that arose and how you took people out of the Ebola-stricken countries when they fell ill. If we didn't have a solution to that, we couldn't have one. Government wasn't going to be able to get it together quick enough, so philanthropy stepped in and in a very effective way. I think of the way my wife's foundation, which is about women's empowerment, and particularly in the business sector in developing countries, uses mobile phone technology in order to help women grow their businesses, right? These are innovative solutions where government can only do so much, but philanthropy can come in and provide not just additional support, but most important, additional creativity. And then thirdly, I think one of the things that I still think both government and philanthropy should do more on is think of new applications of philanthropic principles. Now, let me just give you one interesting example that may, from the work that I do in Africa, that may strike you as a little left field, but I actually think it's really important. So, for many, many African countries today, if they want to relieve the poverty of their people, the key to it is to develop the infrastructure of the country. And the key to it particularly is around things like electricity and power, right? If people don't have access to that basic infrastructure today, everything else is harder. And yet if they've got access to it, if there's electricity, there's access to technology, and that can liberate a whole lot of solutions to problems that people have. But how you put that together is not as simple as it seems. Now, here's an interesting thing. The Obama administration's Power Africa initiative, I think, was a good idea of how you can put together development support, the private sector, but also the voluntary sector in trying to deal with this issue. How do you get the expertise into government to get them to be able to put the power generation proposals together in a good and sustainable way? Another example is when countries are developing their resources, one of the things I find is that many of these countries are trying to develop their resources. They rely on their traditional civil service. They've just not got the skill set, right? And you're dealing with people on the other side of the table who've got massive resources and intellectual assets to put at their disposal, and yet you're negotiating the future of your country when you're developing your oil, your gas sector, your mineral sector. So how do we generate the ability for help to be given to governments so that you can equalize that, that contractual process, and so that in those countries where they're trying to develop their resources, really important, they develop in the right way and not the wrong way. Because resource development can be hugely important, or actually, as we know, it can end up as much a curse as a blessing. In the other thing that I do in my philanthropic work, which is countering extremism, again, we need new applications of philanthropic principles to find out, well, what's the best way of trying to affect radicalization? How do we stimulate more open-minded education in place of the closed-minded education young people often get? I'm just giving those as examples, but the point is that philanthropy can provide, again, new frontiers of work as the world changes, and move into them faster and more effectively than government. And yet government, in the end, is also going to have to help those applications succeed if we're to make progress. Fourth, I think I had real experience in government of where philanthropy could raise the awareness of an issue. Make Poverty History in the 2005 Gleneagles Summit was of huge importance. And here's the interesting thing about government. Sometimes you want to pressure government, and sometimes that's the purpose of an awareness campaign. But sometimes the purpose is to enable government. I mean, I was faced with a situation where at that 2005 summit in the G8, I was having to persuade all the fellow leaders that instead of talking about the global economy and doing all the usual stuff, we'd actually put Africa and climate change on the agenda. There, the philanthropic or voluntary sector, the Make Poverty History movement, the climate change movement, they were enormously important, not in pressuring me, because I didn't need to be pressured, but in enabling me by providing the support in public opinion to make the change necessary. I think if you look at people trafficking, slavery today, I think you could find a very similar example of where the philanthropic movement can combine in order to create awareness of an issue and therefore change. Finally, I think that one of the most important things that I've learned is that in a world in which everything is global, ideas often don't get pushed across the boundaries of nation or culture in the way that they should. I mean, one of the good things about the Global Philanthropy Forum is that people come together and we learn so much from each other, and we learn not just about the individual issues, but how you're tackling them, and the mechanisms and processes of philanthropy and change. And I think this is hugely important. In the work that we do, for example, at Howard Buffett Support, if you take a country like Rwanda, where we work in trying to improve the systems of governance and things like agriculture, to have a philanthropic sector that's able then to tell you the best practice going on around the world and how that might affect change in a country, this is of huge importance. And yet we don't spend nearly enough time, in my view, learning from each other and learning the things we could do with each other. So, to summarize, I think my experience is that the philanthropic sector is of vastly greater importance than it ever was when I was starting out in politics. Some of the best ideas and innovations and creative thinking come from the philanthropic sector, but we still need to recognize that the force of government can be a force for good or not, and has to be mobilized, often to make philanthropy work in the best way possible. And the clearer and nearer we get to that kind of idea of partnership and the right relationship between government and philanthropy, the better we will be. And I suppose the final point is really that we should be in relationship with one another, because although I've had some very harsh things to say about the processes of government, and you could probably testify to all the frustrations of dealing with government, I also have to tell you that I've seen public servants in government do the most amazing work, and the best of those people are motivated by exactly the same mission and desire to serve as any philanthropist. And they're often doing it in very, very difficult circumstances. And I remember when I visited the Ebola countries just a couple of months back, I mean, I was, of course, proud of my own team and proud of the work that outside agencies were doing, but I was also, extraordinarily impressed by the patriotism and service of young men and women in those countries who were stepping up, prepared to be trained, and going out on the front line and actually risking their lives day in, day out in order to put their country back on their feet. So there's nothing, as you all know, there's nothing more exciting than seeing change in action. There's nothing more exciting than being part of that change. And the truth is, the best of government and the best of philanthropy, in the end, share that mission to serve. And if they work together, they can fulfill that mission better. Thank you.
But because so much, I know you're just back from the Middle East, but so much of your work is focused on Africa, I'm going to mostly stick with that. But just picking up on your last point of, in essence, government service and philanthropic service being, in many ways, motivated by the same impulse. Are you finding in Great Britain, and as well as in the African countries in which you work, that the next generation, folks who really want to see their country succeed, are attracted to government service? Or has that been kind of demarketed in many places, and isn't there, and if so, what can one do about that?
Yeah, I think it has, it has in some ways. I don't know, what is wrong with government? Part of the trouble is, I think, particularly for the younger people that I think of, I think of my children and their friends and so on nowadays, who are public service oriented, they just find the processes of government I mean, very slow, very uncreative, and sometimes, more interested in the process itself than the substance. And I do think we need to kind of change that. And one of the things I tried to do when I was Prime Minister, and probably did more of it towards the end than at the beginning, by the time I sort of got hold of the, how to do the job type of thing. One of the things I tried to create was a sense that being entrepreneurial, if you like, as a public servant wasn't wrong, but then you need to do a lot of things to protect people in those situations because they fear. I mean, I come across countries where, having gone from one extreme, which is corruption determining things, you then go to the other extreme, which is people deciding, right, in order that no one accuses me of being corrupt, I'm just literally going to, there's no box that's ever going to be ticked. So I think we can, how we get the right people into government and empower them is a big, big debate. And this is a debate that is true whether you're in a Western democracy or whether you're in a developing nation that's still at the foothills of sort of political development.
And of course, the problem with democracy is it involves that hard work of consensus building at every turn, right? So that is harder in many ways than it might be to get things done in a different setting.
It is, but I think also, and this is where the philanthropic sector can make a difference. My view is that in time, I think this debate's gone away a bit in the last few years, but I think it's going to come back. The whole reinventing government debate that was done by Al Gore and Bill Clinton here, and myself, Gordon Brown and others in Europe, I think that's got to come back. In my view today, government should be strategic, but it should be willing to engage across the board in partnerships, particularly with the voluntary and third sector, in order to deliver things. Because government can set a framework. Government is poor, in my experience, at actually doing the stuff.
So on the topic of demarketing, often when people talk about Africa, they refer to two Economist cover stories. And one was, I think it was Africa, the Hopeless Continent. And then several years later, it was Africa Rising. And sort of this bipolar experience to look at these two. Does Africa, or much of Africa, suffer from a kind of out-of-date bad brand?
I mean, I think it's changing, to be fair about it. But people sometimes say to me, what do you think about investing in Africa? And I say, well, it's a ridiculous question. I mean, there are over 50 countries. Some are in a very poor state. Some are doing extremely well. So I think Africa itself is getting into the situation now where it's differentiating its own. The fact is, these are different countries. You've got some European countries at the moment very strong economically, some very weak economically. If you said to people, what do you think of Europe as a whole? I mean, people would say, well, it depends what part you're talking about. So I think the same should be true in Africa. In my view, however, there are two big changes that give me a lot of hope. The first is that I think there is a new generation of leaders, politically, business, and civic society, who are smart, capable, determined, and most of all, think the destiny of their country is in their own hands. Right? This is a big thing for me. In other words, they're not interested in saying, well, it's because of this or it's because of that. They're saying, okay, we're going to sort our own problems out. And the second thing is that because of the need for the resources, I mean, there are pluses and minuses in this, which we can come to, but there is, and because capital and technology are mobile, you can develop your country and get it to a completely new standard of living, certainly third world to second world. How you get on from there is more difficult, but there's no doubt at all, and this is where the impact of China, although there are a whole lot of issues and questions that come along with it, on the other hand, the fact that there is now an enormous amount of investment coming into Africa is important. We need to use that carefully, to do it in the right way, but I wouldn't ignore the enormous importance of that. The middle class in Africa will double in the next 5 years. And actually, so is philanthropy, given an enormous amount for Africa. I mean, one of the things I keep saying to people is, it's very important that we tell our own public opinion in the Western countries, especially 10 years on from that Gleneagle summit. By the way, a lot of it worked. Okay? I mean, life expectancy has gone back up. You think of the people, 10 times as many people getting access to antiretroviral drugs for HIV/AIDS. You think of, the millions and millions of extra kids in primary school. You think of virtually on the whole range of killer diseases, enormous progress made, still huge numbers of things to do, okay? But you would have to say Africa is in better shape today than it was 10 years ago.
And some of that being philanthropic investment, but some of that just being smart policy choices made by the various governments. And we're seeing the kind of the opening and connecting of the various economies. Let's talk a little bit about investment in infrastructure. I mean, where the Kenyan Railway is being built. There's going to be a road from connecting Cape Town to Cairo. There's an extraordinary amount of investment going on right now in just core basic infrastructure, and then of course in healthcare and other sectors that one would refer to as investments as well. Do you worry at all about the governments that are making these investments falling back into debt? And are they able to sort of tap capital markets the way they need to in order to finance this much needed work?
Well, I think these are really good questions. I mean, you see, the infrastructure is vital, and the capital is there in the world to invest. Right? But one of the things you realize is that how you put that together is not easy. It's actually complicated. And one of the areas where my foundations is one, I think, of a number of trying to do this, but with our foundation, we're now trying to recruit people and partnerships that allow governments to get the access to the best possible advice as to how to put project financing together. You see, for example, one of the things I used to think was, it must be pretty easy to build a power station. They're getting built all the time. I mean, it can't be, literally it's not rocket science, it's power station science, but there appear to be a lot of power stations built, so that's how I know politicians are simple people, so that's how you look at it. But then when you come to how you do that and financing it, you realize the regulatory framework matters. They've got to get the right rate of return. What sort of fuel do they use? What are the long-term contracts? This is, it may not be rocket science, but it's financial science and financial engineering, and it's not easy. Now, I think what we need to do, and this is where I think the Obama initiative on Power Africa is an interesting example of where we go. I think if I was doing the Gleneagle Summit again, the G8 Summit today, 10 years on, I think I would go into that whole area and say, how is it that we take the expertise in the West and make sure that available for any developing government that wants it is top quality advice on how to do those things properly? Because otherwise what you find is some poor energy minister is struggling with hugely complicated and difficult questions and finds, in the end, a sort of paralysis comes over the government as a result of it. Now, lots of infrastructure spending is happening, but we could do more. And there are big infrastructure projects, I don't know where Jim Kim spoke to you about Inga Dam and so on and so forth, but, there are different, look, some of these things may be viable, some may not, but East African Railways is a very good example. You do some of those things, you're going to liberate the country in a way that, frankly, small-scale projects are not going to do. So this big infrastructure today is very important, but philanthropy can help, because if we're going to wait for governments to put all this together themselves, we'll wait for a long time. Now, it's not that it won't happen, by the way. It will happen. In the end, it will happen, but we can accelerate it massively. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. And can help, in essence, in structuring the deals. When I think about what the African Governance Initiative does, in essence, you embed in governments technically capable individuals who, they're technocrats, they're bureaucrats who know how to make things happen. Is this the right description?
Yes. What we do is we do two things, really. And the teams live and work in the country. We help the government sort out what their real priorities are. One of the most difficult things about government is prioritization, right? Because in a sense, everything's a priority. And one of the things about a political leader is you can't say something's not a priority. People go nuts. So when I was British Prime Minister, I had this thing that, my top 3 priorities were education, education, education. And I was very pleased with this soundbite, which is excellent. But, I remember the next day someone said to me, so you don't care about healthcare? And they said, no, I do care about healthcare, but sorting out, you see, I see these reports written by international bodies for these countries, and it will be poverty reduction strategy 2030, right? Yeah, it'd be great. But, what are the first 5 things that are going to set you on your way? So that's what we try and help them do, to identify that. And then we try and restructure the government. Because here's the other thing about government, which is absolutely fascinating. You see, the decision maker, you have to build the right structure around the decision maker so that they can focus on their priorities and take the decisions and then track implementation, right? And if you're not careful, we did an analysis for an African president, and we showed them that of their stated priorities, which were excellent, less than 4% of their time was spent on them, which was not so excellent. But that's because they were chaotic. Right? People would come in and see the president, just they wanted a meeting, they'd have a meeting. There was no sort of, there wasn't a system in place. So the other thing that we do is we try and, because this is what I learned as Prime Minister, if you don't systematize the center of government and the decision making, then what happens is you either the system manages itself, or alternatively, or perhaps as a consequence, you don't really deliver those priorities. So that's what we focus on. Occasionally we will bring in technical expertise, but I want to be very frank with you, Jane. We could do 15 times more if, for example, there was a facility to have a team of pro bono lawyers that would come and advise a country that's about to engage in a series of mining contracts as to how to do that properly, okay? And all of that's, by the way, there's lots of people who'd be willing to do it, but it needs to be organized. Or, Norwegians and others do a great job on advising on some of the oil and gas issues, but the fact of the matter is, there is huge experience now as to what works and what doesn't. I'll give you another example, education and healthcare. I know of great projects around the world, in some of the poorest parts of the world, where they're delivering some basic healthcare and basic education. So why can't we take that expertise and look at how we push that across so that governments are aware of it? I think we should actually get to the point with governance where, as we do in many other walks of life, you would have almost a sort of intellectual corpus of evidence and analysis as to what are good things and what are bad things. Because government, for all I'm stating all the problems with it, it is complicated. And people who are decision makers, believe it or not, usually would prefer to take the right decision, not the wrong decision, but they need the knowledge.
Yeah, so almost a knowledge commons that can be tapped. You mentioned Ebola when you were speaking earlier, and I wanted to just point to, or learn from you, there was a situation in which I believe what you did was use both of your foundations when it came to Ebola. That is to say that the African Governance Initiative was calling for the resources that are needed, while the Faith Initiative was working with religious leaders and ensuring that people were able to follow practices that would protect them from Ebola. Say something about how you mix and match those tools.
Well, the Faith Foundation had been doing a program as part of the anti-malaria campaign, and basically what we were doing was getting, because a lot of the African countries have got a mixed Muslim-Christian population, getting the pastors and the imams together and then mobilizing, training members of their congregations so that they could go out into their communities and say, look, here, we may have the bed nets, but this is how the bed nets just on their own are not enough. Here are the things that you have to do. Here are the symptoms you should look at. Here's why you must immediately contact your, the healthcare workers particularly if you're a pregnant woman, you notice problems. So we then built up, we actually reached about 2 million people in Sierra Leone with this program. And so the idea is also to use that infrastructure of faith to deliver. And I think, again, there's lots of things, there's a civic society aspect to many of these countries where there's enormous strength in some of the institutions of the civic society, much more than there are in government, by the way. Which we could mobilize a lot more effectively if we wanted.
When you look at what happened, I mean, I know that the three countries that were the epicenter are very dear to your heart, that you've spent a lot of time in Liberia and Sierra Leone and Guinea. We're beyond the point of crisis, but the impact is still dramatically felt. The damage, a lot of damage was done. Talk about their recovery. Each were countries that were emerging from conflict, doing quite well. Huge setback for all three.
No, it is a huge setback. I mean, I'm going back out there again very shortly to visit all three. So what can we do to turn the crisis into an opportunity, as it were? I think, first of all, there are real lessons in healthcare. There's no reason why some of the structures put in place can't remain and be built upon for what you might call more normal times health provision. We learned a lot about the inefficiencies that there are within those systems and how they could be corrected. And secondly, there is the opportunity to mobilize international support for those economies and to look at them as a whole and to see what are the changes within those economies that would make a real difference. So, for example, in those countries that are part of the Manu River, part of West Africa, there are things that they could be doing together that would make an enormous difference. There is infrastructure they could do together. There's trade facilitation they could do together. There are a whole series of things that they've learned from having to work together in the course of this crisis that they could put into practice in the future. So, I think what I keep saying to the presidents in those countries is the most important thing is not, okay, once the crisis has passed and you've defeated the disease, that everything just goes back to normal again, because that would be to squander the painful but absolutely necessary things we've learned about what's wrong with those countries and how they're governed and their systems in the course of the crisis.
There's a lesson in there for philanthropy as well. In general, at least in the US, that health-focused philanthropy tends to be disease-specific rather than on strengthening the whole system. And I think there were opportunities in Nigeria and elsewhere to repurpose, but it's also true that strong health systems that may be a little less sexy and jazzy than eradicating a disease is essential to a functioning government.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I mean, look, I think the philanthropy is the help that's given in the immediate crisis and for the eradication of some of the key diseases. I think all of it is immensely important and useful. It's that I think in my own philanthropy, well, that's people are doing that and they're doing that really reasonably well, I think. But what can we do to make sure that the health service system operates effectively? So, for example, when we help countries in their health department do child and maternal mortality programs, again, what works is pretty clear. The things you need to do, how do we get their systems to do it?
I want to go to another, obviously an epidemic like that is a real setback, but there's other potential setbacks that stem from climate change, from unstable climates, from weather extremes. You're known around the world for the role you played in the Glen Eagles G8 summit, and I'm wondering the degree to which you find that in your post-government life, you're also needing to play a role in bringing attention to climate change and focusing on the potential solutions. And with that in mind, I'm also going to ask you what hope you have for the Paris summit in December, or the climate convention.
Well, I think, and by the way, I'm happy to throw it open to questions for anyone. I think, we've come a long way on the issue. I mean, I was involved in the Kyoto negotiation when, let's be clear, in that negotiation, there were many, many countries that weren't signed up, including this one, I think. But there were, but actually everyone used to point the finger at America, but lots of, I don't think India, China, I don't think any of the main developing countries either were really signed up. So you fast forward now, I think everyone accepts this is a global responsibility. Every country, even countries like India who were very reluctant at a certain point, now have got their programs in place. The problem, I think, is very simple, it's a synchronizing the response with the urgency of the challenge. And, I had this discussion in government with all of the leading scientific advisors that I had. And, this is now sort of, when I left, the consensus was still very clear. This was a man-made problem. We had to tackle it urgently. I don't think that consensus has diminished now, really, at all. And therefore, my anxiety is that we're not acting fast enough and far enough. And I totally sympathize with policymakers in this, because some of the decisions are difficult in circumstances where you're dealing with a long-term problem, but you obviously in electoral politics particularly, people are saying, well, yeah, okay, but what about tomorrow, and do I pay more for this? Now, I think my advice that I've given on the Paris summit is not to make the best the enemy of the good, but to get the best deal you possibly can together that accumulates the stated obligations of the countries concerned, and create a framework where it is clear international policy is only going to go in the direction of more and more moves against, against carbon emissions, and so that you're creating a momentum behind the development of the science and technology that, in my view, is the crucial thing here. You're not going to persuade the developing world that it shouldn't consume, but you may be able to find the ways of the consuming sustainably. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think you need, and I think you need to get this put together and driven forward, and the relationship between the US and China in this regard, I think, will be, that's the essence of it, frankly, because you're over 50% of the emissions.
Yeah, and of course, much of the science that has been developed it's been part government, but it's in part philanthropy that has supported it. And what's interesting is that, to your earlier point, some of the innovative solutions have come out of nonprofits working alongside governments to help them think it through. Jim Kim yesterday said that one of his measures of success in Paris will be whether developed states are willing to agree on a carbon tax.
Yeah. I mean, I agree, but will they? I think, this is a slightly sort of controversial thing to say, but I think my experience as a government leader would be this, that because we've got a very tough set of positions in the UK and in Europe now, I think the most important thing is to look for practical solutions that are going to drive this forward. Now, whether you can get, the trouble with a tax that you agree as part of a treaty is, everyone's got to come on board, otherwise, it's very hard to implement. So, I think the sentiment is right, but there may be other ways you can price carbon that will allow you to do it.
In fairness, he actually said price, right. Agreed upon price on carbon.
Well, I would completely agree with that. I think, but the science and technology is vital, and this is where the link with the philanthropic sector is very important, because government, the one thing for sure is that government's not a great chooser of the technologies of the future. I think all the history of that, although what government can do, by the way, is provide a lot of the research, financing and so on, and that can make a huge difference. And we should never forget that, Silicon Valley, grew out of, I think, large defense research facilities at the time. So, but this is where, the more I go on, the more I'm a believer in innovation in government and outside of government. And so I'm looking for ways continually as to how do you stimulate innovation. And the thing that I like to work on now with the governance side of what I do is how do we get government more able to open itself up to innovative thinking and change.
Yeah. So I'm going to invite those who ask questions to share innovations that you find particularly compelling as part of your, and let me just, as folks are warming up and raising their hands, take you to a different part of the world, and that is, well, to the Levant more broadly, and ask you, what is the appeal, in your view, of extremist organizations like the Islamic State or Daesh, whatever you call it? It's attracting young men from Britain, it's attracting young men from the United States, it's attracting young men from Nigeria. What is the appeal and what is the counterweight?
There's a whole other session on this one. The appeal is I mean, it's a commitment to an ideology, and that can often give people a sense of purpose in their lives because they've got a direction. It's also able to exploit what are weaknesses within a lot of the governance of those states. And it can only be countered. I mean, there are lots of things you have to do in the immediate to counter it, and security and so on, but it can only be countered ultimately by a better idea. And this is a whole other subject of conversation, but I would actually like to see a similar movement to the movement we were just talking about on climate change and the environment. I would like to see a movement develop for what I would call a global compact on education, where we accept it as part of the global responsibility of any government to educate their young people to an open mind. And thank you. I think this is it's a very touchy issue for people, but you see, I think that one interesting thing about this is, as I say, it's a whole other topic, but just in the same way as I think you found a lot of resistance on climate change to begin with, I think a lot of people now would say, well, we'll run our education system how we want, thank you. And I think at a certain point in time, you've got to say, no, it's not just I'm afraid this is a problem for all of us. But if you've got millions of young people educated to a closed-minded view of the world, do not be surprised if you end up with a problem.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, you've noted that both capital and technology are mobile, but so is talent. And so are people enormously mobile now. So most of these questions that we used to address as national are now transnational, right, issues. So do we have questions from the floor? Yes. I think we'll have to bring a mic to you.
Someone's running over with one.
And I'm going to give you another one to think about, and that's displaced persons. So after this, we'll
Virgílio Viana from Brazilian Amazon. Good to see you after many years here. It's good to see your enthusiasm, as usual. And I completely share your view on the importance of efficiency in government, and also your call for good advice for governments. But we also should take note that there are lots of bad advice. And I'll just recall the book of Damiza Mojo about the dead aid in Africa, how aid has lent a lot of problems to Africa. So I'd like to get your views on the role of South-South cooperation. You did mention in passing experiences in education in different parts of the developing world that could be used by other regions. So how do you see the role of South-South cooperation or triangular cooperation to promote the Sustainable Development Agenda?
So what I'm going to do is take two more questions,
right.
So you can take all three. So yes, right here. And then we'll need a microphone over there.
Hi, I'm Fran Perrin from the Indigo Trust. As Prime Minister, you established both a strategy unit and a delivery unit. And I wonder if you think the challenges for philanthropists are more of strategy or of delivery, and what advice you would give the next British Prime Minister about the role of philanthropy.
Hello, my name is Jonah Whitcamper from the Nexus Global Youth Summit. As a parliamentarian and as someone who recognizes the need to overcome the global democratic deficit that we have so that we can have a more globally collaborative world that is not controlled by dysfunctional nation states but by a global community, what strategies do you recommend for democratizing global decision-making processes? There are inter-parliamentary unions. People talk about reforming the Security Council. What are your favorite proposals getting mayors of the world to come together?
Thanks, Jonah.
That's a big questions. I mean, I think South-South is really important, and I think, for example, Brazil with West Africa, why not? There's lots that you can do there, and Brazil's got big investments now in Africa. But I think the most important thing is to I mean, I would agree with your triangular approach, and get the best ideas that are out there that can come from wherever they come from, and implement them. And where I think that for a lot of governments, they just literally don't have an awareness of what they could do differently. Okay, and systems just tend to run themselves. It's an amazing thing. I mean, one of the first things I always say to the presidents or prime ministers I work with is, if you've got a happy protocol, it's probably a bad sign. Because these are the guys that arrange the meetings and, have all the ceremonies and the bands playing and the red carpets. And, I remember one of my early presidents, and, every time he left the country, the whole cabinet had to come out and wave him off. And then when he came back, the whole cabinet had to, I said to him, it's wasting their time. We've always done it like that. I said, well, don't do it like that in the future, would be my advice. So, I think you can, sometimes I think, though, it's easier for governments of the South to take it if it's coming from the South as well. So this is where I think, if we work it in the right way, I think we can make a very, good contribution. But getting that cooperation on governance, I think, is really important. It brings me to the next question, because, for example, obviously when you're talking about a Western, let's say, healthcare system, there'll be a limit to how applicable some of those lessons are when you're talking about basic healthcare in a developing country. And so it can be easier for someone with the similar types of problems to offer a better idea of solutions. However, the reason we did a strategy unit and a delivery unit is because without the strategy, the delivery wouldn't work, and vice versa. And here's the thing that you find, and we actually had a policy unit as well. Right. So, and I changed these mechanisms in government in my second term, because what I did in my first term in government, and as I always say to people, the weird thing about government is, in no other walk of life would you put someone with absolutely no experience of doing a job into a really top important job and say, get on with it. I mean, it's just politics, but it's weird, really. You'd say, what's your experience of it up to now? But no, you win the election, that's fair enough. Then in you go. And
at least you have a parliamentary system.
Yeah, but I was always saying my first and only job was prime minister, and it's well, if you're going to start at the top. But so but the reason I changed the mechanisms in government is that in my first term, I thought if I just beat the system harder, it would do more. And it actually did do a little bit more. But the trouble was, when you stopped beating it, it stopped doing it. Right. So in my second term, I said, no, we're going to reorganize the way we do this. So we had our priorities, but we needed to get the policy absolutely right, because policy matters. I mean, it really matters, okay? We had to get the strategy of how you put it in the overall framework of government, the direction of the country, right? And then you had to track the implementation and do it in a very clear way. And I think the same must be for a philanthropic organization, but it's the same with any organization. I always say to people, the interesting thing to me about leadership, whether it's philanthropy, government, or running a soccer team, it's the same thing. You know, you've got to work out what your problems and your challenges are. What is it you're really about? And then you've got to have the structures in place to implement. And I think that is really important. And it kind of slightly segues into the third question, which I also think is really interesting question. And I've got lots and lots of thoughts, but I haven't got time to express them, which is the executive part of a political system matters. So does the parliamentary part. Okay, but here's the really interesting thing to me, is that parliaments, you know, members of parliament, they also need quite a lot of training in what it is they're trying to do and how they're trying to do it. Because otherwise, what happens is that parliaments just become forums for opinions, which are fine, that's part of what a parliament's about. But if you're not careful, that very quickly goes off into interest groups. If you're not careful, that very often goes into whatever makes a big noise, do that. And actually what you need is a parliament that is sufficiently informed, has sufficient structure in the way it's organized and operated, that it can really contribute to how a country is going to develop. And it's just an interesting thing to me that you often see, and this is, by the way, sometimes this gives democracy a bad name, is that you see parliaments operating in a way where, frankly, you wonder, you know what they're adding in terms of the dynamic of the democracy and ability of people to have their view, but they could be so much better. And one of the things I've become very passionate about over time is how do you make democracy more than just an election, and how do you give it substance? And how do you make sure that it is effective at delivering for the people? Because otherwise what you find, and this is a very common argument you'll get in many developing countries, people kind of say, yeah, but we're better without proper democratic control. Now, I don't personally think that's true, but you've got to be really honest about it. You look at certain countries and you think, the parliament doesn't really function in the way a parliament should, in the sense of holding the executive to account, but in a really honest and decent way.
And there's a third piece to that puzzle, and that's an engaged citizenry. I wanted to ask you about the setting in which reforms are done. Very often, when you have a reform, those who might be losing a special benefit are well organized, keenly aware of this benefit, in a position to make their case, while the broader public that might benefit from the reform may not be as aware, as mobilized, as able to speak for itself as a whole. What is the role of civil society organizations in writing that balance?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, well, first of all, I think their role is really important because they can sometimes articulate. So you take education reform, it's a very necessary thing in many developing countries. Very, very necessary thing. Hugely resisted by parts of the system. You actually need civic society to be able to articulate the voice of what is otherwise an unspoken sentiment because it's not really organized. Okay, but I always used to say when I was doing education reform in the UK, the single biggest injustice you can give a child is a poor education. So if you're telling me, if this school's a bad school, do something about that. But and this is why you need to be prioritizing, and you need to be, with your strategy, aligning with your policy and your delivery. The single hardest thing, I bet any of you will know this, even in running your own philanthropic organizations, the single hardest thing is making change. Right? People always resist change. Right? And, by the way, if they don't, I remember, again, in my first term doing a pension reform, and I was quite pleased with this reform. It seemed quite bold. And about 2 years after we'd done it, I remember having a discussion in the cabinet room in Downing Street. I said, we don't seem to have had much opposition on this pension reform. And they said, no, we're not any opposition. And then I thought, yeah, I bet we haven't really done a reform. And that was absolutely right. Anyway, I made up for that, I may say, in the next reform. But if so the rhythm of change that I learned in government was that when you're first proposing a change, everyone tells you it's terrible. When you're doing it, it's hell. And after you've done it, you wish you'd done more of it. So but I think that's true virtue of any organization. But where civic society can play a role is provided it's prepared itself to be quite bold in what it says, it can actually sustain a government in taking the difficult decisions that are necessary for a country.
So the whole concept of the rhythm of change makes me feel like that's the right concept for this room. So please all join me in thanking Tony Blair.